you're not used to this. We're still in Exodus chapter 34, studying the qualities of God that God himself gives to Moses. And so I wanted to start off class just by reading that passage, and so we have it in our minds. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him, Moses, there, and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed... 34. Yes, I'm sorry, Exodus 34, and I started in verse 5. Yeah. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. And Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshipped. And so we've gone through this list so far, and we're up to, we did slow to anger last week, and we're doing abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And I think this is fascinating because he kind of repeats it twice. He uses the word here for steadfast love and faithfulness twice back to back. So we have steadfast love and faithfulness, and then keeping steadfast love for thousands. And that's what we want to dig into this morning. I did want to acknowledge, and I think we've kind of talked about this every class, all of these qualities, this is God as a whole. Like when we dive into one quality to really learn more about it, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that none of these qualities operate outside of the other qualities. So, Todd's going to talk about, because it seems like a stark contrast that God's talking about his steadfast love and forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but then he says, I'll by no means clear the guilty. So all of these integrate together, and I wanted to acknowledge that right at the start of class, that we keep that in mind. But I also wanted to say, let's really dive into this idea of steadfast love. I like the translation loving kindness a lot, and so I'm probably gonna use that when I talk about it. But I did want to talk about, and start off talking about the words that are here. Because I know, even before this passage came up, I have heard Tammy and Craig, I think, bring up the Hebrew word that's used here. I know Steve's used the Hebrew word here. I know Austin has referenced it briefly. So I wanted to know if anybody knows the Hebrew word that we translate the steadfast love from, hesed. Okay, yeah. So a lot of you know it, which is kind of unusual, right? Like how many Hebrew words do we know? Can anybody know like why this is such an important word, or why it's so common that we study it or know about it? Like what's unusual about the word? Did I see your hand raised, Tammy? No? Oh. You were just fixing it.
I had a class on Ruth, right? Yeah, it was Ruth. And the loving kindness was constantly
Okay.
said.
Was that Daryl? Or okay.
Daniel.
Okay, so I wasn't here for that. So it's been talked about. Okay, great. Anybody remember like why we emphasize, like why that gets brought up so often?
It describes God's covenantal love. It's that special covenantal love that God has for his people.
Okay, excellent. Anything else? Anybody else want to part of it? That's a hard concept for us to communicate in English, and I think that's why the Hebrew word hesed, if you look at different translations, there's a lot of different options. I'm reading from the ESV right now, and that's where we heard steadfast love. Anybody else looking at a translation that has a different wording?
CSB has faithful love.
Faithful love. I think the 1995 translation of the New American Standard Bible likes to use loving kindness, and that's one of the ones I like. So there's a lot of different translations, but that's because this covenantal love that Austin referenced, we don't have that in the English language. Like, this is a word in a different language that encompasses a lot of ideas and a lot of depth that our language doesn't really have a word for that. And I see this isn't all that uncommon. I see this on social media. People bring up, like, this word in Spanish means, has this cool meaning, but there's no similar word in English. This word that was in ancient Scottish has this meaning that we don't have in the English language. There's no parallel word. And so it's tricky for us to translate the concept of Hesed into English. And that's what I really want to try to dive into here this morning. As an example to go to, if you switch over to Psalm 136. This is
36.
136, Psalm 136. This is when I signed up for this passage, for this quality in Exodus 34, this was the reference passage I immediately thought of. Like, Austin was like, you have a different, another passage to reference, and I was like, I'm thinking of Psalm 136. So out of curiosity, anybody who's like, you've read through the Bible, you're doing Bible readings, when you read Psalm 136, like, how do you read it?
Like a song.
It's like a song, yeah?
Yeah, to me.
A very repetitive one.
It's very repetitive. Like, we get kind of bothered by repetition like that, right? I find myself, when I get to the psalm reading it, that I tend to be like, all right, give thanks to the Lord for He's good, for steadfast love endures forever. Okay. Give thanks to God for He's God of gods. Like, I'm not really reading it like thoughtfully because it is so repetitive. But doesn't it tell us something if it is that repetitive? Like, shouldn't that communicate something to us? Again, I'm curious, like, does anybody have another translation for steadfast love endures forever instead of that in the psalm? Because even the different versions sometimes translate differently. Mercy, okay. Which, when I was reading about this word, like, all of the different ways that we translate it, they're all accurate. They all encompass the thought that's here in Hesed. Any thoughts on that so far? Either in how it's brought up in Exodus 34 or Psalm 136.
I guess the thing it always does for me, because it's not how everything in my life comes to me, is how, going back to this covenant, I appreciated that Austin grabbed that right away, because I think that's the root of this business of Hesed, God's loving kindness, is that this is the God that's in my covenant relationship, that I have a covenant relationship with, and how dominant He is, and how insignificant I am. I'm just constantly undone by the reality of how completely dependent I am on this relationship and Him who just occupies the whole thing, how little I contribute to something. And so when we get all these aspects of His grace and His mercy and His forgiveness and His compassion, it just says to me how big this covenant relationship is and how little I bring to it,
Yeah.
how totally dependent I am on Him.
It's overwhelming, right?
It's overwhelming.
And I love that you brought that up, because that's exactly where we ended the passage when I read it. It was like, Moses hears it, and he's overwhelmed. He's like, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to fall on my face and worship God because, like, there's no, what do you say to that? Like, and you said insignificant, and sometimes I think when I hear insignificant, I think like, well, to us, to God, we're not insignificant because he went to such great lengths. But I think what you're saying is our input to this covenant is insignificant.
Yeah,
Like
what
we're
I
not,
bring to the
yeah, we're
table.
not bringing anything to
Right.
the table hardly, but it's all God at that point. I think Todd first.
So I'm glad you went to Psalm 136. You had to. You couldn't escape that. But,
You would have brought it up if I didn't.
Well, it was coming up. So, even more so than Exodus 34, and I think Exodus, you can't escape it in Exodus either. The idea, everything that God is because he has the personality, the quality of loving kindness. Everything that he is born out of that. So, and I don't want to, step on myself, but even when you get down to things like discipline and justice, where you might think that is perhaps cruel, it is not. Godliness, God's justice and God's discipline and punishment is born out of loving kindness, because everything from God is born out of that.
Yes. And I love you bring that up, and we don't want to get too much into your class for next week. But like,
We won't remember it, but
yeah. But oftentimes when we see and hear the imagery of God raining down fire and judgment and death and destruction, I don't want to remove anger from that. But if we approach those concepts as a human, it's hard for us to not think of that as just like mindless rage, just like, you made me angry and I'm just going to destroy everything. Because that's more how we operate. But I think Lisa was the one that mentioned that the word she had was mercy. And I think so often we remove the concept of mercy from the concept of justice. But for God, they're integrated. Like mercy is part of the justice. The loving kindness is part of the justice. All of these things are perfectly melded in ways that we have trouble doing. Chris.
Yeah, I wonder if we haven't, in our modern day interpretations of this, at least in a lot of our teaching, of this as a contract, as a covenant, as a contract, relegated it to sort of our business contracts today, as opposed to really associating this with a marriage contract, which God does so richly throughout Scripture. And in a marriage contract, I get a better concept of what Hesed might be, how it might operate, as opposed to just a transaction that is usually void of things like mercy. It may, shall, you're using terminology to protect yourself as opposed to using terminology to protect and care for the other party. And I think I think we've done ourselves a disservice at times by making this too associated with the wrong type of contract in our society.
Yeah, I like that because, like this, when we make contracts, it's a deal, and deals can be broken or we can lie, and like there's all sorts of ins and outs and there's loopholes but with the marriage covenant, as God describes at the beginning of the two becoming one flesh, the covenant that He's made with Israel is a blood covenant. And like I think I get the imagery, like it's not what they did, but I get the imagery sometimes you see in movies where like people like they cut their hands and then they shake and like their blood mixes. But that's the imagery of like our life is now intertwined together. Like you cannot separate that. Our lives are connected through the very most, like, lowest base level of life force. And that's what God has done with Israel. He said, like, you are my people. And I'm not just saying that, I've made that happen through a blood covenant with you. Our lives are intertwined. And that's the same imagery in the New Testament then with Jesus describing as the church being his bride and Jesus as the bridegroom, that same covenant is occurring between us and Christ. Any more thoughts from there? Okay, I wanted to try an exercise out that's a little bit unusual for what we normally do. And I promise you there's a point. I'll have questions for you afterwards. But it's a meditative exercise that has to do with loving kindness. And I'm curious for you guys to experience it and see. We're going to draw it back to this passage in God. So I wanted to acknowledge up front, it might feel a little bit weird. It's not what we normally do in class. So if you feel comfortable with it, go ahead and close your eyes. If you're not comfortable with that, don't close them. Take some deep breaths, kind of get into a meditative state. As we're talking about these concepts of mercy, loving kindness, steadfast love, see if you can notice, like, from within yourself, like if you were feeling those things, projecting them outward, like where do they come from for you? For me, I tend to notice it more kind of where my heart, what physically is where I feel those feelings coming from. So take some breaths. If you feel like this is weird, kind of acknowledge that. Uncomfortable, be like, yeah, it's weird. That's okay. So first I want you to try to take those feelings of loving kindness and direct them towards yourself. And focus on the feeling versus the behaviors that we use to demonstrate our love for others. This is about that energy from the feeling. Direct that towards yourself. So after you've tried that, now let's take that same feeling that we're trying to project and direct it to a close loved one, like a child or a spouse or a very dear friend. And now after you've taken a moment to do that, let's take it a step further and direct those feelings towards maybe someone not quite so close. Could be, a more extended family member. Could be another friend, but who's not, quite on the same level of the previous friend we talked about. Somebody that's kind of in the middle for you. Okay, now let's keep taking further steps. Maybe take it to a coworker or a neighbor, somebody that you maybe care about some, but you're not super close to. Okay, now after that, let's take it towards someone maybe that you have some dislike for. Another easy one is coworkers. Maybe you have a coworker that you kind of feel like is always bugging you, always in your way. Same thing could be a family member that you're not on good terms with. Could be another driver on the highway on the way here that you got annoyed with. Try to project those good feelings of loving kindness. Okay, now let's broaden the expanse of those feelings towards the community around us, whether that's Issaquah or wherever you live or the greater Seattle area, whatever fits for you, go for that. Okay, and then now let's really expand and kind of give that loving kindness and project it towards all of mankind as a whole. Everything that's going on in the world, all the different nations, all the different peoples out there, try to send them that loving kindness. Okay, take a good breath, and you can kind of come back, open your eyes, let's come back to class. So, kind of just want to start with, like, how did people feel about that? We'll start with, like, anybody feel like that was a good experience for them, or they had made good connection, it was meaningful in some way? Lisa?
I felt like it was easier in the beginning and got harder farther out.
Right. Did it get harder? Did you notice it getting harder for you once you got to people that you didn't like as much, or did it get harder as you broadened the expanse of, like, the number of people? Because we started out with, like, individuals, and then we got to, like, many people.
I think the way that I like internalized exercise, I find it easier to have allowances for things I don't like if I love the person, and as I got bigger groups where I see the wrongs are heavier, and like Rwanda conflicts and
Right.
Somali pirates, I found it much harder
Right.
to have love
Yes.
for
Yeah.
behaviors I don't like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Steve?
It's interesting, I was almost backwards from Lisa. I started off, my self-talk is really bad.
Yeah.
Really bad. And I can be quite critical and unforgiving of myself. I don't think I'm very gracious towards myself. So I started off instantly going, oh, yeah, that's not good.
Yeah. So I have the same issue. Like because theoretically it should be like it's incrementally, like the way Lisa is kind of describing experiencing it. I think that's generally kind of how you'd expect it. You're starting off easier and you're making it harder and harder and harder. For me, I'm the same way. Like, and I think other people, like, your internal dialogue is really negative. You don't have the same amount of mercy for yourself as you do to some others. So for me, it was like it starts out hard. It gets a little bit easier as I go to some other people, but then once I start getting to, like, people I dislike, and like Lisa's talking about, like, I'm thinking about the different wars and conflicts that are occurring, I'm like, well, it's hard for me to feel loving kindness towards all of that. Okay, anybody else? Tammy?
It's like prayer, to me, that's where I go when I go to pray, and then I don't have anything left to say, and then it's just, I do that during my prayers.
I love that. That's awesome. I think for me, when I was introduced to this meditation, that was something that I was lacking. And like, it really is an exercise that you have to practice and work at doing because it is hard. Like, it's hard for us, whether it's to direct it for ourselves or direct it to other people and our enemies. It's difficult. Curious if anybody was like, this didn't make any sense to me. I hated it. It was stupid. And anybody feel that way about it? Like, that we're like, I don't get it. Okay, so nobody was like, I hate this. That's okay, which is good. I'm glad. While you were doing that, and I mentioned that I kind of wanted you to focus on the feeling versus the behaviors. Can anybody this is very intangible, so it's hard to talk about and describe. But can anybody try to describe, while you were directing that loving kindness, what was happening underneath that layer of, like, I'm directing loving kindness towards Amanda, for example, because she's my close person, or Finn. When you were doing your equivalent of that, what's happening? Like, when we say loving kindness, what's underneath that? Like, what other emotions, or like, what are you doing? Okay. What about like goodwill or good intent towards somebody? Anybody doing that? Like for like if I think about Finn, like, well, I want what's best for him, and I want him to grow into the best possible person he can be. I want good things to happen to him. Did anybody mind take them that kind of direction with this? See, Tammy's nodding her head. Lisa's like, nah, I didn't take it that way.
I did. I mean, I feel like it was easier for me to send it to everybody. It was just like, I mean, I don't know you, but I hope that, you know.
Yeah, good things happen for
Yeah.
you. I like that, Chris.
Yeah, there's just for me, there was just this tenor of, it ended up being a tenor of appreciation for them as humans, as God's creation. And so it was easier for me to focus that on people where I had a depth of relationship, but in a sense it was easier too when I counted more on God as the sphere got broader.
Gotcha. And that's interesting that you point that out, because, and I kind of agree with Mackenzie, like, once you get to the bigger picture, if you're not focusing on a particular conflict or nation that you don't like or whatever, like if you're just thinking as kind of mankind as a whole, it's a little bit easier for us to be like, yeah, I want good things to happen for the world. Like I want world peace. As we get more specific, it's harder. For me, I really think that embedded in loving kindness is that underlying goodwill, good intent. Like I want good things for you. And coming back to God now, I can't help but think of, Hesed's not used when Joseph talks about it because he doesn't like quite phrase it, but at the end of Genesis when his brothers come to Joseph and they're like, Jacob's dead, we don't want you to kill us and get revenge. And Joseph tells them that everything you meant for evil towards me, God meant it for good. And I think that that's the concept of that even though Hesed wasn't the word, that is the concept that is occurring, that God's goodwill and intent, everything that's happening to us, whether we can see it or not, whether it looks bad right now or not, whether it looks bad in the world right now, God's will is good towards it, us. Any discussion? Todd?
So, Exodus 34, we have God and Moses having a conversation. God tells Moses, essentially, I epitomize loving kindness. And then he tells, and Moses had, okay, well then, go with us, right? I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But then God says something which might contradict what our idea of loving kindness is. Because he tells them, okay, this is what you guys are going to do. You're going to invade, and you're going to break things, you're going to kill people, and you're not even going to give them a chance. You're not going to make covenants, which doesn't take them long to, mess that up. But right after he gets done telling Moses, and he is this compassionate, merciful, loving, kind God, he says, now, set about wrecking this place. Is that a contradiction? Or is this just some part of loving kindness that we don't understand?
I like that question because I've talked to Amanda a lot about this. And it's probably not completely in the scope of this class or what time we have left. But like he's about to go into, the like it's not just this his description of himself of his loving kindness. But like you go through the 10 Commandments and it's like, don't kill, don't lie. But then what do? God's like, go slaughter entire nations, man, women, children, animals, nothing's left of them, kill them all. Don't lie. Oh, but I want you to be spies. Go into Jericho, pretend like you're part of their nation. I'm going to reward Rahab for her deceit and deception towards the people of Jericho as she submitted to God to do that. So there's a lot of seeming contradictions. And I think, I'm actually going to talk about this in some of that in the sermon briefly. But I think that it's really important for us when we study the Bible that we look for those contradictions. I think every time seems like there's a contradiction, something sticks out to us as weird, like, wait, you just said this, but now you're saying something that sounds different. Like, those are big flags for us of like, this is something about the nature of God that I don't fully get. I'll let other people talk if they wanted to comment on that.
Well, it's just not a short answer.
No.
And I think that's my point, is we can't compartmentalize the God.
No.
We can't take his characteristics and try to just kind of force it into the round hole that we've decided that it belongs. And I think it's okay for us to say, I don't know. I don't know. It works. God is not a liar. But it's okay to not completely understand it all either.
Yeah. Lisa.
A couple of us went to the women's lectureship at Kirtland, I think it was last month. And one of the things they were talking about is that there are some essentially counseling principles that we can learn from Jesus about how to get people into a receptive state to the gospel. And the third tenet was unconditional positive regard. Like, you have to look at people the way that God looks at them and have an intrinsic sense of their own worthiness and what they meant to God. And it seems like that's this exercise. It's
Yeah.
like getting in a mindset that we see people the way that Jesus saw people and have that positive, instead of seeing it from a judgmental standpoint of like chronoplazing their faults, having an internal positive feeling towards them that makes us want to share what's most important.
Yeah, excellent. That's exactly it. I think kind of tying that with what Todd was just describing, God has removed a huge burden from us, even though we keep trying to take it on. But the burden is judging. We don't have to judge the Canaanites. We're not called to judge the Canaanites or have any opinion about the Canaanites. God made that call, as he does with all judgment. I think at the verse when he says, vengeance is mine, like, I will repay. Like, God has control of all vengeance, and he will decide when it's time to dish it out. And so when he asks them to kill off all the Canaanites in Exodus, that's God's call, and that's not our burden to make that decision. But he does call on us to look at mankind with the same love and compassion that he does. That he desires all men to be saved and that none should perish. That's our job as his children, as his servants. And there's a sense of judgment that does occur there that will happen inherently, but it's not that final, ultimate judgment that's occurring with the peoples in Canaan in Exodus. I did want to ask, there's a couple of points that I wanted to draw from that exercise that we did. Was that practice of directing your loving kindness towards others, is that an action? Are you doing anything? Yeah. But it's not the same as the behavior of Like I can meditate all day long about my goodwill towards my wife, but that's not quite the same thing as me bringing her flowers just because. Bringing her flowers just because could be happening absent of the loving kindness. Like it's like trying to teach Finn to say like he's sorry, but it's like mean it when you say it. That's really hard to combine the intent with the behavior, which is why it's helpful, I think, to practice the intent, which is an action and is meaningful, but practice the absent of the act, the behavior itself, and then we can integrate them. But the thing that I think is so cool and amazing is, like, we're still in Exodus. We're thinking big context here that God has, at the beginning, we recently talked about this in class. God appears in the burning bush to Moses, and Moses has this conversation for a God that has been seemingly absent from Israel for 400 years. And they're on a like, what's your name basis at this point. Like, hey, you're God. Like, hi, I'm Moses. What's your name? I don't know who you are. And what does God tell Moses his name is? I am. And he uses the word, the Lord, as Jehovah or Yahweh, which means the existing one. Same thing as I am. The existing one, to me, when we talk about God's loving kindness endures forever, I'm thinking past, present, future. I'm thinking like, okay, it goes on from this point on, it keeps going forever. But God is the existing one, it just is. Like, he just is. And if loving kindness is a quality of God, and that goodwill and good intent is a quality of God, then that also just is. It's not past, present, future. It's just all-encompassing. And so circling back to that idea of Joseph, when he's saying God's, like everything that happened that you thought was to hurt me, God had a plan that meant good for me. And that's so hard for us to maintain focus on and maintain faith in that when Joseph's whole life, like huge chunk of Joseph's life, was just bad thing after bad thing after bad thing that was devastating every time. And yet you maintain the perception that God, loving kindness, God means good for me throughout all of this. And I think when you tie that into the idea that God is I am, he is the existing one. Before you were conceived, before you ever existed, God's will towards you was for good. Throughout all of the trials and challenges you have for your life, God's will is that good happens to you. I think that's one, so for me, is so moving, it's so encouraging. There's a little bit of heartbreak in it, though, that of like, I am going through all these challenges and trials and things that hurt me, and you're wondering, like, is God there? Like, where's this goodness? To me, that's the value in studying this and seeing, like, this is a quality of God. This is a core element of God, just as much as a core element of himself is that he is the existing one. His loving kindness exists and endures forever. Any comments from that, Steve?
I have been thinking since you said it that just having good feelings towards someone is only part of Hesed, because Hesed is very much an action word.
And that reminds me of, I had another comment, but go ahead, where were you finished?
I'm just.
I forgot, you reminded me the thing that I was going to say that I forgot. So, okay, so tying in the existing one, now let's go back to another quality of God in the very beginning of Genesis and creation. How does God create? How does God create? And yet he speaks with words. When we speak, do things happen? Like speaking is an action for us, but like we don't create things out of our words. And so I think that's what another thing I wanted to draw from that exercise is we're directing that goodwill and good intent, but that's only part of, as Steve said, that's only part of the equation. Like we ultimately need to tie that goodwill and intent, that loving kindness, with our behavior and actions. But God, just as he speaks things into existence through his word, God's will is made manifest. Like God's behavior and his will are not these separate parts of the equation. They are fully integrated. When God wills it, when he directs goodwill and good intent towards you, it is. Like that is, there's no additional, like the actions are all integrated into it. It is just as much as if I bring Amanda the flowers as God's will is made manifest. Like he doesn't need to do those two different things. I need to feel the loving kindness and then I need to do the action. Steve.
Isn't it interesting how similar loving kindness is with the faith that we need to have?
Yeah.
We have to have faith as a concept, but if it doesn't translate into something that we do, it really is an empty faith.
Yes.
In the same way that God, if his covenant doesn't have action to it, if it doesn't result in something, it's shallow. It doesn't mean much.
Yes, absolutely.
And in just the same way that we then see who he is, that should cause our faith to become different.
Yes, yeah, and that's that transformation. That's the argument that James is making in his letter about faith without works is dead. But we so often split the works and faith into two different things when it should just be, it's all one.
It goes back to Lisa's comment. I saw you trying to go there, but it goes back to her comment from her ladies' class that we need to see people different. But if it doesn't result in us behaving different towards those people, it was just a concept that had no real value.
Yes. Yeah. Please.
When God taught us to pray, he taught us to start with like acknowledging and praising him for who he is. And it seems like in some ways that's like the same, like setting the intention, that we start with training ourselves to acknowledge God and his goodness and that we can put our faith in him. And if we had that same verbal exercise that followed that up with, and people, our words and people, and we would set our intentions to care about people by that same repeating it to ourselves out loud, essentially.
Yeah.
And then our actions would follow better. It's like we learn a prayer to be the of God. Mostly, we say it's for him, but it's for us too to
Yes.
learn who God is by repetition. And that back to Psalms 134, 136, that was a repetition thing that people would say in response. His loving kindness endures forever, and they would learn it. And so we could learn good intentions and goodwill
Yes.
for other people as God taught us.
Exactly.
Saying
Yes.
it to ourselves.
And that's actually the perfect way to end the class, because that's the goal. Like, God doesn't have to practice doing this because it's his innate quality. We have a hard time doing it. Like, it takes active effort on our part to practice having good will, good intent, loving kindness towards others, and then tying that into making behaviors and actions out of that. That is a practice, that is effort, but it is modeled off this innate quality of God that we see in Exodus.